The most produced Allied tank of the Second World War caught fire from a single penetrating hit, not occasionally, not in rare circumstances, systematically, predictably, often before the crew had time to unbuckle their harnesses. By 1944, German anti-tank crews had a name for it. They called the Sherman the Tommy Cooker. The British crews, who died inside them, called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighters whose advertisement promised it lit first time, every time. The advertisement was accurate, so was the nickname. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States produced 49,234 Shermans. It was the backbone of Allied armored operations in North Africa, Italy, Western Europe, and the Pacific. More Shermans were built than any other Allied tank in history. More Shermans were also lost to internal fires than any comparable vehicle on either side of the war. The U.S. Army knew about the fire problem before the tank entered combat. Engineers had documented it, test crews had reported it, ordnance officers had written memoranda about it that went up the chain of command and did not come back down with solutions attached. Production continued. This is not a story about a design flaw that no one noticed. It is a story about a design flaw that everyone noticed, that the institution responsible for fixing it decided was acceptable, and that thousands of men died inside as a result. The Sherman tank did not fail because its engineers were incompetent. It failed because the system that deployed it decided that production numbers mattered more than the men operating the machines it was counting. That decision had a body count. This is the dark story behind the M4 Sherman tank. To understand why the Sherman existed the way it did, you have to understand what the United States Army believed a tank was for in 1940. The answer, formally codified in U.S. Army doctrine, was that tanks were not for fighting other tanks. That was the job of tank destroyers, a separate vehicle class, a separate doctrine, a separate branch. Tanks, according to the Army's official position, existed to support infantry. They were mobile artillery platforms. They were breakthrough weapons. They were not, under any reading of the doctrine that existed when the Sherman's basic design was finalized in 1941, expected to engage enemy armor in direct combat. This matters because the decision about how much armor to put on a tank, how tall to make it, what caliber gun to mount, and critically, where to store the ammunition, flows directly from what you believe the vehicle is going to face. If you believe your tank is going to fight infantry and soft-skin vehicles, you design differently than if you believe it is going to fight the Panzer IV. And if you believe it will never face the Tiger I, which did not yet exist when the Sherman's basic design was finalized in 1941, then certain engineering trade-offs that would otherwise seem catastrophic start to look acceptable. The man most responsible for the Sherman's basic architecture was Major General Jacob Devers, Chief of the Armored Force, and the institutional pressure he was operating under in 1941 was singular and overwhelming. The United States needed a tank it could build in enormous quantities, ship across an ocean, and put into the field before the war was lost. The M3 Lee, the Sherman's immediate predecessor, was already considered a stopgap. The Sherman needed to be ready fast. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant broke ground in September 1940. By June 1941, it was producing tanks. The American industrial machine, once pointed in a direction, did not stop. It accelerated. The Sherman's design was finalized in August 1940, before the tank existed as a physical object, and the design choices made in that process were not revisited in any meaningful way for the next 3 years. The hull dimensions were fixed, the engine bay configuration was fixed, the ammunition storage locations, which would become the central problem, were fixed. What was being fixed in the United States in 1940 was not a tank designed to fight the war that was coming. It was a tank designed to be manufactured at a rate that the war required. The difference between those two things is the entire story. The Sherman was not a bad tank for what it was designed to do. In North Africa in 1942, when it was first deployed against German Panzer III and Panzer IV variants, it was broadly competitive. Its 75mm gun could defeat the armor it was facing at combat ranges. Its mechanicals were reliable in a way that German armor frequently was not. Its turret traverse was faster. Its crew ergonomics were better. It was easier to maintain, easier to recover when knocked out, and easier to replace. The 2nd Armored Division, which took Shermans into combat in Tunisia in late 1942, reported favorably. General Dwight Eisenhower wrote to Washington that the Sherman was performing well. The feedback that traveled up the chain from North Africa was broadly positive. The feedback that did not travel up the chain, or that arrived and was not acted upon, was the reports about fire. In Tunisia, tank crews noticed something. When a Sherman was penetrated, not destroyed outright, but penetrated, it had a tendency to catch fire with a speed and totality that other vehicles did not. German crews who examined knocked-out Shermans after engagements documented the same observation from the other direction. The vehicle, when killed, burned, and it burned fast. The engineers who would eventually investigate this had a name for what was happening. They called it catastrophic ammunition cook-off. What it meant inside the tank was rather worse than the clinical phrase suggests. In a conventional tank design of the early 1940s, the ammunition was stored in the floor of the hull, below the crew, or in armored bins positioned around the fighting compartment. The logic was straightforward. Put the most explosive material as low as possible, use the tank's own armor and mass as a buffer, and hope that a penetrating hit would strike crew compartment walls before it reached the propellant charges. This worked tolerably well in many designs. The T-34 stored ammunition in bins in the hull floor with some degree of separation from direct penetration paths. The Panzer IV, in its later variants, armored its ammunition storage separately. Neither solution was ideal, but both reflected an understanding that the ammunition was the most dangerous thing inside the vehicle and deserved particular engineering consideration. The Sherman made a different choice. When the M4 was designed, the primary ammunition storage was placed in sponsons, the bulging side extensions of the hull, positioned at roughly crew chest height on either side of the fighting compartment. The sponsons were not separately armored. They were not isolated from the crew compartment by any meaningful barrier. They were close to the vehicle's widest point, which made them easier to hit, and they were directly adjacent to the crew positions, which meant that when they ignited next to the people who were trying to escape. The reason for this choice was not incompetence. The sponson placement solved a real engineering problem. The Sherman hull was a specific width, its turret ring was a specific diameter, and the fighting compartment had a specific arrangement that made floor storage difficult to engineer without a major redesign. The sponsons were accessible, the layout worked, and in 1941, fighting a tank that could reliably penetrate Sherman armor at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters was not the primary design scenario being planned for. By 1943, it was. The German 75mm KWK-40 gun, mounted on upgunned Panzer IV variants from mid-1942 onward, could penetrate Sherman frontal armor at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. The 88mm guns mounted on Tiger I tanks, which entered combat in late 1942, could destroy a Sherman from distances at which the Sherman's own gun could not respond effectively. The tactical environment the Sherman had been designed for, numerical superiority, mechanical reliability, infantry support, had been replaced by an environment where the Sherman was being asked to fight vehicles it had never been designed to face. The ammunition sponsons, which had been an acceptable engineering compromise in 1941, became a liability in 1943 that produced visible, measurable casualties. The mechanics of what happened when a sponson was struck were documented in detail by a 1945 report from the Ordnance Department. when a penetrating round entered a sponson, or when a hit generated sufficient heat and fragmentation adjacent to one, the propellant charges in the stacked rounds ignited sequentially. The first charge ignited the second ignited the third. The process was not an explosion in the conventional sense. It was a sustained, self-feeding fire that reached temperatures sufficient to melt aluminum components and that produced toxic gases faster than a crew could clear the hatches. The average time from sponson ignition to full vehicle involvement was documented at under 15 seconds in the worst cases. The average time for a crew of 5 to evacuate a Sherman under combat conditions, working against the pressure of battle damage, jammed hatches, and disorientation, was longer than 15 seconds. This arithmetic was not hidden, it was in the reports. The solution, when it finally came, was elegant and straightforward: wet stowage. By surrounding the ammunition bins with water glycol mixture contained in a thin outer jacket, engineers could prevent the sequential ignition that caused catastrophic cook-off. A penetrating round would still damage the vehicle, it would still likely kill crew members in its direct path, but it would not produce the sustained fire that turned the sponsons into incinerators. The wet stowage system was developed and tested by mid-1944. It was retrofitted into Sherman production from the M4 A176W variant onward. The W in the designation stood for wet. Shermans equipped with wet stowage were documented as being approximately 4 times less likely to suffer catastrophic ammunition fires than earlier dry stowage variants. 4 times. The wet stowage system added approximately 280 pounds to the vehicle's weight. It added modest complexity to the ammunition loading process. It did not require a fundamental redesign of the hull or turret. It was not, by any engineering measure, a difficult modification. The dry stowage Sherman entered combat in North Africa in late 1942. Wet stowage reached operational units in meaningful numbers in mid to late 1944. The gap between those two dates is approximately 20 months of dry stowage Shermans operating in combat environments where the fire problem was known, documented, and survivable with a modification that existed. In November 1942, following the first large-scale Sherman deployments in Operation Torch, the Ordnance Department received reports from field commanders noting the fire frequency. The reports were specific. They named units, named engagements, named the conditions under which fires occurred. They were not anecdotal complaints. They were operational assessments from officers who were watching their vehicles burn. The Ordnance Department's response was measured. A study was commissioned. The study would take time. Meanwhile, in Sicily in 1943, Sherman crews fighting in the bocage-like terrain of the island's interior encountered a new tactical reality. The Germans had learned that the Sherman's sponson was its most vulnerable point. Panzer crews were documented as specifically targeting the hull sides at combat ranges. The engagements were short. The fires were immediate. The study was still ongoing. By early 1944, as planning for the Normandy invasion accelerated, the Army had 3 sets of data in its possession simultaneously. It had the North Africa field reports, it had the Sicily operational assessments, and it had the engineering evaluation of wet stowage, which had been sufficiently developed by late 1943 to be tested in controlled conditions. The decision that was made, and it was a decision, not an oversight, was to proceed with the D-Day landings using the dry stowage Sherman in the primary armored role. The justifications were institutional and logistical. Production lines were configured for dry stowage. Retrofitting existing vehicles would require time the invasion timeline could not absorb. The tactical doctrine of numerical superiority, sending more Shermans rather than better Shermans, remained the Army's official position on how to compensate for the vehicle's vulnerability. Losses were expected. Replacement vehicles were available. The arithmetic of attrition, as the Army calculated it, was acceptable. The crews who were doing the burning were not consulted whether the arithmetic was acceptable. The men who fought in Shermans in Normandy in June and July 1944 encountered something the operational plans had not fully modeled: the Normandy hedgerow terrain. The bocage, dense networks of earthen banks topped with thick vegetation dividing the Norman countryside into a maze of enclosed fields, forced tanks to present their vulnerable whole undersides and sides when cresting embankments. The sponsons, already the vehicle's weakest point, became systematically exposed in the terrain where the campaign's first months would be decided. The 2nd Armored Division, the 3rd Armored Division, and the British armored units equipped with Shermans under Lend-Lease all reported the same tactical problem. The vehicle that had performed adequately in the open desert of North Africa was being asked to fight in conditions that magnified every vulnerability the fire reports had already documented. The 3rd Armored Division, which entered combat in Normandy in late June 1944 and fought through to the end of the war, reported a total loss rate from its Sherman inventory that historians Stephen Zaloga and Victor Madej would later calculate at approximately 580%, meaning the division lost the equivalent of its entire vehicle complement nearly 6 times over through the campaign. The majority of those losses involved fire. The crews developed their own informal doctrine in response. Sherman crews in Normandy stripped their external fuel cans, a precaution against spills igniting from proximity to engine heat. They redistributed their ammunition loads, moving rounds away from the most exposed sponson positions, even when this made reloading slower. They learned to keep hatches partially open during movement, trading the protection of a sealed crew compartment for the seconds of egress time that might be the difference between surviving a hit and not. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The Sherman had been part of every major American armored operation from late 1942 onward. It had fought in 5 theaters. It had been operated by the armies of 12 Allied nations under Lend-Lease. It remained in production until the last months of the conflict, and variants of the basic hull served in armies around the world for decades afterward. Israel's modified Shermans, designated the M50 and M51, with updated guns and power plants, fought in the 1967 Six-Day War and the 1973 Yom Kippur War. The chassis that had been designed in 1940 was still being asked to do combat work in 1973. The fire problem in the dry stowage variants was documented in after-action reports from North Africa in 1942 through the final campaigns in Germany in 1945. The total number of Sherman tanks lost to all causes across all theaters was approximately 8,000 American vehicles, with the remaining Allied losses bringing the combined total higher. The proportion of those losses attributable to internal fires specifically was never precisely calculated by the Army. The precise number was not something the institutional records sought to establish. What survives, in archives at the National Museum of the United States Army at Fort Belvoir and at the Tank Museum in Bovington in Dorset, are the reports that circulated between 1942 and 1944, the field assessments, the ordnance studies, the engineering evaluations, in which the problem is named, quantified, and in several cases accompanied by proposed solutions. The wet stowage documentation exists in those archives. So do the production schedules that were not adjusted to accommodate it. Several complete Sherman tanks of the dry stowage era survive in museums. At the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, a standard M4A1 sits in a display configuration representing the vehicle as it appeared in Normandy in 1944. The sponsons on the hull's flanks at crew chest height are visible. They do not announce themselves as the most dangerous part of the vehicle. They look like hull geometry. They look like engineering. They were both of those things. Here is what the Sherman story actually is. It is not a story about a bad tank. The Sherman was not a bad tank. It was reliable, it was producible, it was maintainable. Against the armor it was designed to face in 1941, it was a reasonable vehicle. It is not a story about engineering failure. The engineers who identified the fire problem and developed wet stowage were doing their jobs. The modification they produced worked. It worked when it was tested, and it worked when it was deployed. What it has always been, if the records are read without the softening filter of official history, is a story about institutional arithmetic. The United States Army calculated that the production schedule mattered more than the retrofit. It calculated that replacement vehicles were cheaper than the engineering time to fix the vehicles already built. It calculated that the acceptable loss rate from fire was tolerable within the larger mathematics of armored attrition. The crews who performed the calculation's remainder were not given access to it. The men who burned inside dry stowage Shermans in Tunisia, in Sicily, in the Normandy hedgerows, in the Ardennes winter, they did not know that the vehicle they were inside had a documented fire problem with a known, tested, available solution. They knew that when the vehicle was hit, it burned. They knew that 15 seconds was not always enough. They knew it in the way that people inside a burning thing know things, completely and without the benefit of the institutional perspective that had decided somewhere up the chain that the arithmetic worked out. The arithmetic worked out differently from inside the tank. The Sherman exists today in museums and in history books as a symbol of Allied industrial power, of the capacity to produce, to replace, to overwhelm by volume. That reading is not wrong. It is incomplete. The complete version includes the 20 months. If you want the complete version of these stories, the engineering, the decisions, the distance between what was known and what was done, subscribe. There are more of them.